The Corbett Report is brought to you by you. Your support makes the Corbett Report possible. Sign up for the subscriber newsletter or purchase a DVD at corbettreport.com/support. You're listening to the Corbett Report. corbettreport.com.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of the Corbett Report. I'm your host, James Corbett of corbettreport.com, coming to you, as always, from the miserably rainy climes of Western Japan, here on this 30th day of August 2013. Welcome to episode 279 of the Corbett Report podcast, Who's Really Behind the War in Syria? Well, as everyone knows by now, unfortunately, we are moving closer and closer towards what is looking increasingly like a unilateral U.S. strike on Syria in the coming days. And while it might not be the full-scale invasion that some people are preparing for, it will undoubtedly be a very provocative incident and one that could be exceptionally geopolitically destabilizing at a time when tensions are already running high between, for example, the U.S. and Russia, on the brink of a G20 summit coming up in St. Petersburg next week. That, again, can be a very destabilizing event. So we are on a knife edge in a number of different ways, and this is being recorded on the afternoon of August 30th, 2013 here in Japan. So by the time it gets to you, perhaps the missiles will already be flying. But the question that is on everyone's mind right now, not only the listeners to the alternative media and programs like the Corbett Report, but even people who generally get their information from the MSM, is why is this happening? What is this really about? Because one thing is absolutely certain to the vast majority of the public, in fact, the 91% of the American public, that as in a recent poll indicated, want nothing whatsoever to do with this strike on Syria. The real question is, what is this really about? Because it certainly is not about chemical weapons.
There is no doubt here that chemical weapons were used on a massive scale on August 21st outside of Damascus. There is also very little doubt, and should be no doubt, for anyone who approaches this logically, that the Syrian regime is responsible for the use of chemical weapons on August 21st outside of Damascus.
It appears Americans don't want an intervention. Here's what a latest poll has just revealed. Just 9% of the US citizens who were taking part in the survey want their president to act, while about 60% say that America should stay away from this civil war. When asked about Washington's support for the opposition, about 1/10 said that Obama should do more for the rebels than just arming them, while almost 90% don't want America to help the opposition in any way.
While many Western leaders call for a military strike in Syria, some of their citizens are opposed to a costly military intervention at a time of economic austerity at home. A group of demonstrators gathered outside the Prime Minister's office in London after Britain sought UN backing for action against the Syrian government.
But they're going to make it worse. They're going to ruin it. And they're going to make it like Iraq, and we don't want it to happen there. We don't want Syria to be same as Iraq.
The indiscriminate slaughter of civilians, the killing of women and children and innocent bystanders by chemical weapons is a moral obscenity. By any standard, it is inexcusable, and despite the excuses and equivocations that some have manufactured, it is undeniable.
All the U.S. brings behind is death and destruction. It's the United States, which is the most genocidal, murdering regime which has ever existed on the face of this planet.
What's happened has been heartbreaking, but when you start talking about chemical weapons in a country that has the largest stockpile of chemical weapons in the world, where over time their control over chemical weapons may erode, where they're allied to known terrorist organizations that in the past have targeted the United States, then there is a prospect, a possibility in which chemical weapons that can have devastating effects could be directed at us.
Protesters rallied outside Downing Street on Wednesday against possible British military intervention in Syria, as Prime Minister David Cameron recalled Parliament to discuss the response to the alleged use of chemical weapons against civilians by the Syrian regime.
The weapons inspectors are in the midst of their work and will be reporting in the coming days. That is why today could not have been the day when the House was asked to decide on military action. For this House, it is surely a basic point. Evidence should precede decision, not decision precede evidence.
It is clear to me that the British Parliament, reflecting the views of the British people, does not want to see British military action. I get that, and the government will act accordingly.
When even members of the British Parliament are calling out your war propaganda for what it is, I think you have a PR problem on your hands. And that is exactly what the Western allies of the imperialist warhawk faction have on their hands right now, trying to sell this war to a public that is very weary and wary of interventions in Middle Eastern countries after the debacles of the past decade, and the complicity of the corporate mainstream dinosaur media in all of these adventures abroad. So I think the public is definitely waking up to this, and I don't know about people's personal experiences out there, but from what I've seen in basically every website that I've seen these types of stories being posted on, including the dinosaur mainstream media websites, comment after comment after comment is calling out this propaganda for what it is. And that is a hardening sign. People really are waking up to the tricks, and I'm seeing more and more people, even in mainstream discourse, raising the possibility of maybe this was a false flag. And there's a lot of good reasons for believing exactly that. And in fact, I'll throw a link in the show notes for today's episode to an oilprice.com website link that talks specifically about the reasons that not only was this almost certainly a false flag chemical attack to be blamed on Assad, but actually perpetrated by the terrorists in Syria, but that the U.S. probably knew about it in advance. And that's an interesting article coming from a relatively mainline site like oilprice.com. So I will throw that link in so you can take a look at that. But again, it raises the question of, if this is not about the cartoon politics of the chemical weapon strike that almost certainly did not come from Assad, then what is this really about? What is the entire conflict in Syria really about? And this is where we start really digging into some very interesting information, and it is, well, quite complex in some ways, but I think it breaks down in a way that everyone can understand, and that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to break down the different pieces of this puzzle, starting with a clip that I think will probably be familiar to most of the audience by now. It's a clip of General Wesley Clark, the retired four-star U.S. general who was also the supreme Allied commander of NATO back in 1999 during the Kosovo war crimes that NATO committed at that time, who back in 2007 made waves by talking about a plan that he overheard in the bowels of the Pentagon in the days after 9/11, about a plan to invade 7 countries in 5 years, and some very familiar countries appeared on that list, including Iraq, including Libya, and including Syria. So this speech has made the rounds quite a bit in the last few years, and tends to come up every time there seems to be new talk about invading one of these countries that are on this list. So let's take a short listen to this clip where General Wesley Clark talks about what he overheard at the Pentagon.
I went downstairs, I was leaving the Pentagon, and an officer from the Joint Staff called me into his office and said, I want you to know, he said, sir, we're going to attack Iraq. And I said, why? He said, we don't know. He said, I said, well, did they tie Saddam to 9/11? He said, no. And then I came back to the Pentagon about 6 weeks later, I saw the same officer, I said, why haven't we attacked Iraq? We still going to attack Iraq? He said, oh, sir, he says, it's worse than that. He said, he pulled up a piece of paper off his desk. He said, I just got this memo from the Secretary of Defense's office that says we're going to attack and destroy the governments in 7 countries in 5 years. We're going to start with Iraq, and then we're going to move to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. I said, 7 countries in 5 years. I said, is that a classified memo? He said, yes, sir. I said, well, don't show it to me. He was about to show it to me. He said, because I want to talk about it. The purpose of the military is to start wars and change governments. It's not to sort of deter conflict. This country was taken over by a group of people with a policy coup. Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld, and you could name a half dozen other collaborators from the Project for a New American Century. They wanted us to destabilize the Middle East, turn it upside down, make it under our control.
Now, I think a little too much has been made of this speech in alternative media circles of late, at least this go around in the lead up to the impending strike on Syria, because there are a number of things that we should be skeptical about regarding this testimony from Clark. Not only the fact that he is a retired 4-star U.S. general and the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, so I think we should take everything he says with a grain of salt, but also, even if he is reporting accurately what he overheard about a classified memo that he never even saw, we should keep in mind that this was coming out of the Rumsfeld Pentagon in the wake of 9/11, so this is something that he overheard 12 years ago, and this was supposedly a 5-year plan that was meant to kick off with the invasion of Iraq. The invasion of Iraq did take place in 2003, which would mean that this 5-year plan would have been instituted and completed by 2008, which, of course, it was not. Also, it does seem that he was giving a chronological order to the invasions that were supposed to take place under this plan, starting with Iraq, then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran. And assuming that that's the order that this was all supposed to take place in under this classified memo, well, that hasn't taken place either. So we should be skeptical about this and not make too much about this supposed 5-year plan that, again, we have no documentation of, and we're just taking General Clark's word for it. But I think the more important part of this is the underlying policy that seemed to be at play here, and what was really part of this strategy for reshaping the Middle East that very much was part of the agenda of the Bush-era Pentagon under Rumsfeld, and of course directed by the policy planners and Iraq war policy planners of the Project for a New American Century. And when we look at the people who were in the bowels of the Pentagon really planning all of this, we're looking, of course, at people like Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Faith and Richard Pearl, and others who obviously and documentably have extensive ties to Israel, with, in fact, people like Wolfowitz and Faith being actually investigated for their parts in spying for Israel in the past. So we don't have to go out on too much of a limb to say that there was a very concerted Zionist agenda behind the Project for a New American Century and its quest to reshape the Middle East. And Israel